which brings us to today's webinar. The topic is coming back to healthy buildings and planning for a post-COVID-19 world. Moderating today's discussion on the significance of creating healthy building environments is Berdon partner and co-leader of the real estate practice, Bill Saya. Bill is an audit partner and has been with Berdon for more than 25 years. He has extensive experience providing accounting and auditing services to companies within real estate and related industries. Joining Bill are Joe Allen and John Mccomber. Joe is the director of Healthy Buildings Program and an assistant professor at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He's a renowned forensic investigator of sick buildings and is a regular keynote speaker that advises leading global companies on healthy building strategies. John is a senior lecturer in finance at Harvard Business School, and his work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Forbes, the Harvard Business Review, and the Wall Street Journal Asian edition. He is also the author of more than 30 case studies on infrastructure projects, with particular emphasis on office buildings in the United States. And together, they have co-authored Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity. For those of you who received our invite directly, there was an opportunity to purchase that book. And in our follow-up communications as well, we'll be sending links for everyone if you are interested in purchasing that book after this webinar, as it will pertain to obviously the topic of conversation today. With that, I pass it off to Bill, Joe, and John, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Frank. Good morning, everyone. Joe, John, thanks for being with us this morning. I guess before we get into the questions, just thought it made some sense for you guys to tell us a little more about your backgrounds and how you came to be involved in the Healthy Buildings movement.
Sure. So maybe I'll go first, John, and then I'll pass it back to you. So first, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Frank. And thanks to my friend Mike Garcia at Berdon for bringing us together. And my goal, and I think John's the same, is to be a resource to you all today as we think about the questions everyone's thinking about, is how do we get back to the office, return to work strategies in the context of COVID-19 and what we know about disease dynamics, disease transmission, the basics of testing, serological testing. So we all have a million questions. I think, well, hopefully we'll be able to help navigate some of this because one of the biggest challenges right now that I think everyone's facing is that we have a fire hose of information coming at us, and it's hard to decipher what's real and what's not, and to distill that down into tips you can take to think about how to restart your business or return to office safely. So it's great to be here with my co-author, John Macomber here. We have complementary skills. And so my background comes from the public health science. I'm a professor at a school of public health. My real background expertise is exposure and risk science. I'm a certified industrial hygienist. I'm the deputy director of our Center for Education and Research on Worker Health and Safety. But more broadly, or maybe what had a bigger reach in the commercial real estate area is around leading my program on healthy buildings, which examines all the ways that we can design and operate our buildings to promote human health and well-being and productivity and performance. Maybe more relevant to what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 is prior to being at Harvard, I did and still work with companies on forensic investigations of sick buildings. So while COVID is certainly at a scale and scope that none of us have ever seen, a lot of it feels really familiar to me from my consulting practice and time doing this, where we have people dying, we have everyone at risk, lives on the line, we have huge financial stakes in the decisions we're making, and we're in a low information environment but we still have to make and can make good decisions based on the best available science we have at hand and be flexible and dynamic based on that changing science. The science will change by the time we're off of this call. So while this is new and different, it feels quite familiar, and we will talk about this through the course of the time here about what we can do now, what we can think about, what we should be doing in the next couple months, and then also what this looks like longer term. So I'll pass it over to you, John, for an introduction.
Great, thanks. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be with you today. So I'm basically a real estate and construction guy. I spent 30 years leading construction and real estate companies in Massachusetts. Sold that business and came to Harvard Business School 13 years ago to teach kind of real estate 101, how do you build and flip an office building. I got particularly interested in a number of other aspects around resilience and environment, partially around economic development in the emerging worlds, which are driven so much by hard physical infrastructure, which has a lot of characteristics like investing in real estate, and also around issues around urbanization as hundreds of millions of people move to cities, around resource scarcity, not enough clean air, not enough water, not enough land, not enough fuel, too much garbage, too much traffic, and the issues where government doesn't necessarily seem able to address all those things. So a lot of my work is around investing up front in prevention of things that might be problems down the road, whether it's around air pollution or sea level issues. And now with the arrival of this pandemic, and whoever knows what future pandemic there will be, there's all the more possible benefit cost ratio that's favorable to invest in prevention now to avoid future costs later. So our work has kind of evolved that way. Joe and I ran into each other at the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He showed the results of a study that they did at the School of Public Health called the COG-FX study around human cognition. And it was very clear that in office atmospheres where there was even normal amounts of CO2 and other contaminants in the air, that people's their cognitive performance was worse. And being a real estate guy, I thought, wait a minute, how can we have people sitting in our conference rooms and our offices doing worse than they could do? And how can we figure out a way to walk through the finance and leasing kind of issues around addressing this stuff? So that's when Joe and I started to set off on this work.
Great, thanks. So, let's start with the coronavirus pandemic. It's what's on everybody's mind almost 24/7 these days. Joe, you were quoted as saying buildings have a critical role to play in dealing with the pandemic. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so, I think if we look at the historical record, it's really clear that buildings can either exacerbate problems and certainly infectious disease transmission, or they can help prevent the spread. We could look at measles in the 1970s. One schoolgirl goes into a school and infects 28 others despite only remaining in her classroom, 28 people around the school, aided by the spread through the mechanical system. We look at the first SARS and we see these high-profile outbreaks associated with multifamily dwellings where the mechanical system or the design of the building was aiding in the spread of disease. In fact, SARS-1, the entire global epidemic, was seeded from one person who was infectious, went to a hotel, infected 16 other people, and it seeded a global outbreak. So we've long known that buildings influence disease. I was writing about healthy buildings and pandemics as early as December in an editorial I wrote for a journal I edit, talking about how healthy buildings can help us battle many things, but certainly also infectious disease transmission. Related to COVID too, I put out an article in Financial Times in early February saying that healthy building strategy should be our first line of defense against coronavirus. And it all goes back to the basic fundamental principles of what we know about how disease is spread broadly, more specifically how this virus is spread, and then which control strategies align with that. And the buildings here, we could talk about details. I'm happy to get into details, but there are strategies you can take in your building, along with other strategies that we know are proven or towards minimizing disease risk in buildings. And John and I wrote a little bit about this last week in Harvard Business Review, but maybe I'll just stop there. And if you want to get into more details, I'm happy to get to some specifics, but really that's where it comes from. It's grounded in the science, over 100 years of science showing how buildings either aid in the spread of disease or can help mitigate it.
Yeah, I think one of the specifics that, we're hearing from a lot of our real estate clients is that, it's a real challenge to try to figure out how to repopulate these buildings. There's a dozen different things you can do or not do. It's all kind of uncharted territory. And I think, how do you think owners should go about repopulating the buildings as the pandemic eases a bit?
Maybe I'll talk about how John and I framed this last week, and then John can add on if he'd like. But I think this is a really useful framework that others have found useful. I hope this audience does too. So we had an article in Harvard Business Review last week, and we can share it and circulate it. But we talk about this strategy, this multi-layered defense strategy based on what we call the hierarchy of controls. This is not Joe's model. It's not John's model. This is a model that's been used in my field for decades, the field of worker health and safety. And it's 5 parts to it. It's actually quite simple, and it's nice because it gives you a place to put information, this overwhelming information, and it brings some order to chaos. So here they are, and we can talk in depth if you'd like. But the first one is this: you eliminate the hazard. This works for chemicals in an industrial facility, but here, as we apply it to COVID, eliminating the hazard means working from home. And we should continue to encourage that, but that's not a path back to repopulating and restarting our economy. Second in the hierarchy of controls is personnel substitution. So in the first phase of getting back to our offices, who are the core people that need to be back, physically back in your building to keep your business running? Third in the hierarchy is engineering controls. And this is what we talk about in our book, Healthy Buildings. These are all these healthy building strategies that we know are tied to reductions in infectious disease transmission, but also more broadly, human health, performance, cognitive function. We can talk about the business benefits there, but largely that's under the engineering controls bucket. Fourth on the list is administrative controls. So we have to pair the engineering controls with things like dedensification of our buildings. How are you going to handle queues at the elevators? How can you spread people out to maintain physical distancing? And those are going to be critically important. The screening that might occur outside of buildings before people come in. And the last one is PPE, the fifth one. And that's personal protective equipment. And that's, in this context, would be the use of masks for in common areas and even in the elevator. So it's a nice framework. I think it's relatively simple. It puts some structure to it. It's very much how we address security risks and cybersecurity risks, right? Where no one control measure is sufficient in and of itself, but if you layer enough of these, it's a layered defense strategy that is effective and has proven to be effective at minimizing risk. And this is what we're applying to COVID-19 right now. That's the framework we're using.
Right. Do you have any other specific advice for landlords as to what they should be doing right now as they're preparing for for people to return to the buildings?
There's some business thoughts around that, and I imagine you're all talking about that as well. It's not like everybody's coming back right away, and some of these people are never coming back. So, for example, I'm not proud to say it, but I'm a retail landlord, and we have some restaurants. Not a great investment right now. So there's so much chaos around who can even pay the rent, who can even make the mortgage, that the issue of like who's going to wipe down the countertops is secondary. But I think there's also going to be a question of who is responsible for this aspect of safety. So you can imagine a situation where any entity who can still pay their rent or make their mortgage is going to have a lot of negotiating power with landlords and with banks. And the best capitalized landlords will be able to say, I, the landlord, am in charge of making my building healthy. And we're going to scan your temperature at the door, just like we make you show your ID so you don't have any guns. We're going to have 3 people in an elevator instead of 30. And we are going to have you comfortable that we've changed all the fans and filters all the time. You can also imagine a situation where a landlord and a tenant company would say, I can't afford to do that. And it basically falls upon the individuals. So you're going to see individuals come back with masks and with wipes and with plexiglass shields to go between them, or coming back in the middle of the night so they don't have to sit next to their colleague or somebody like that. I think there's going to be a lot of confusion around who's responsible around this. And it's not even clear yet whether health insurance companies or mortgage companies will start to take a look at that, because there's so much uncertainty around the basic issues of who's responsible for this hold. Is it force majeure, and do I just get relief, or do I get compensation? So I think that the most competitive landlords are going to say, this is on me. Before some other regulator comes and does this, I'm going to check people's temperatures at the door. I'm going to think about how the elevator works, and we're going to use some objective way to let people be comfortable back to work. Because you don't necessarily have the situation where every one of your office workers will say, oh yeah, I guess equity officer Vernado or whoever says it's safe to come back to work, you just come back to work. They're going to want some kind of assurance around that. So there's multiple levels of the physical things that you can do, and then the question of, does somebody believe it, and the question of who validates it.
Right. All right. Just moving away from the coronavirus for a moment, and just speaking more towards general issues associated with the healthy buildings movement. In the book, you asked the question, why are we ignoring the 90%? I thought that was interesting. Can you elaborate on what that means for everyone here?
Yeah, sure. So prior to COVID times, this is usually how I opened up presentations, asking that question, why are we ignoring the 90%? And John and I write about this, and there's a couple parts to it. And the first is this, we spend 90% of our time indoors. We are an indoor species. And one way I like to think about it is this. I usually ask people in a group to say, take your age and multiply it by 0.9. That's how many years you've lived indoors. And I'll usually call on somebody or ask somebody to do it, and everybody hates it because nobody likes public math and nobody likes to disclose their age. So, but I'll do it for myself, right? I'm 44, so times 0.9, my indoor age is 40 years, right? I've hit a landmark. It's a landmark year for me here. So 40 years of my life indoors. If we live till 80, 72 years of your life indoors. And when we think about it that way, it becomes really obvious that the indoor environment has this massive impact on our health. But if you stop and think about really what you know about healthy living, very few people will turn to the indoor environment first. Maybe that'll change now with COVID. But you will say, if I asked you, Bill, you would say, well, Joe, I know I should exercise. Yep, 30 minutes a day. I know what I should and shouldn't eat for lunch today, right? You'll tell me all about outdoor air pollution, and we all know this, right? It's in the news. But very few would say, well, I hadn't really thought about, the space I'm in right now and how lighting and acoustics and even the chair I'm sitting on might be influencing my health. It's this real blind spot we have. It's underfunded in terms of research areas, and this is why most people don't know about it. But it is having a massive impact on our health. I think what's changing right now, or the shift that's happening, is that there had been a growing awareness as the green building movement shifted to the healthy building movement. It was a slow rising awareness, but like everything else with this crisis, everything is speeding up. Now, all of a sudden, additional people are knocking on the door asking, hey, we're really starting to think about these healthy building strategies, not for today, but also longer term. What else should we be thinking about in our building, our next project? Trying to capitalize on that recognition that the 90% really matters, and that more of us in the world are recognizing right now just how important the built environment and buildings are to our health. So that's one part of the 90%. The other part is the costs. And here I'll pass it to John to talk about the other 90% we mentioned in our book. Yeah.
So with respect to the costs, we think that let me think how this plays out. Partly, we think that healthy buildings is the natural extension of a green buildings movement. And there was a lot of discussion in the last decades around buildings being greener. And USGBC, of course, did a fantastic job with a pretty simple rating scale around LEED and those things. But that looked at things that were easy to measure, that looked at the physical structure and looked particularly at energy and rainforest woods and local source products and things like that. But it didn't look at the actual human beings. And none of us are really in this business to have the structure be healthy. We want the individuals to be healthy. That's a lot harder to measure. And it's also in different financial aspects in terms of who's responsible for the budget. So you might have a facility manager who gets a pat on the back because they saved 2 cents on electricity or because they stretched the filters a little bit longer. They don't even talk to the person in HR who's looking at the sick days or the productivity of the people. And you see this even in big owner-occupied facilities like at Harvard or Mass General Hospital, and you see it in spades in landlord-tenant relationships. We think this is really short-sighted. So if you think of your firm, Berdon, you probably have about half of your revenue is made up by your salaries. And another 40% or so, or maybe 25% is made up by your rent. And maybe 3 or 4% of your operating cost is energy. So if you save 10% or 3%, like, who cares? So somebody can measure that and they can say, yes, we use less electricity. On the other hand, if somebody's out, even if with the sniffles, or if they're less productive and they miss 2 or 3 days of work, that's 10%. That's percent of their work year. And if you can think that their cognition is being less than it could be because there's too much CO2 in the room, now you're possibly even sacrificing top line if somebody's not making another sales call, not having another creative idea. So what we try and show in the book is that the pursuit of energy in particular, but also greenness in buildings misses the mark. And what we ought to be thinking about is the ability of the human beings to perform and be productive. Now, obviously, we can't correlate your work environment 100% with productivity, because that has to do with motivation and in the task and leadership and those kind of things. But why would we handicap people? Why wouldn't we let people do the best they can do? Now, that's a much different pitch, because we used to be saying, well, the avoided cost is the avoided cost of a couple sick days, or maybe somebody gets a cough in the conference room. Now the cost you're avoiding is somebody being out for months on a ventilator or dying. And so we think there's an even stronger argument for the building to be healthy. And if you want, we can talk about the multiple health performance indicators that we track and that we are saying are how you see the health of the environment and also the health of the humans who are in it. But the basic idea is that beyond buildings being green, we want the individuals in them to have a chance to be as healthy and as productive and perform as well as they can.
Great. So in the book, you guys identify the 9 foundations of a healthy building, but maybe a little more briefly, can you explain basically what is a healthy building?
Sure. So maybe I'll start. Maybe I'll start with the other side of this. Is what's a sick building? We start the book talking about sick building syndrome, which is the era we've been in. And how we got there, right? So we have this era of sick buildings largely came from our decisions in the 70s around energy conservation, where we started to tighten up our building envelopes. We stopped letting our buildings breathe. We do some work with the architect Norman Foster, who talks about this idea of breathable buildings. And we stopped doing that. You stop diluting the contaminants in the indoor air. Bioeffluents, things that come off of us, infectious organisms that we might cough out or sneeze out, chemicals that off-gas off of our clothing and products. And so you create this kind of indoor stew, and it turns out that people start to notice in terms of the rise of sick building symptoms, more sick days, and this has been well documented in the scientific literature. So that was our starting point, but what we're shifting to here, and also I guess in my background, spending a career chasing sick buildings. So I've seen just about every kind of hazard you could think of and everything go wrong in a building. And through all that, in addition to understanding what a sick building is, we then learn what a healthy building is. And in fact, if we just make some upfront improvements to the building, we can avert those future costs related to sick buildings, underperforming people. So the idea of this healthy buildings and the 9 foundations of a healthy building is a report out of my Harvard Healthy Buildings team, which really was aimed at this exact audience, really, in that there's this massive body of scientific literature that we've been sitting on. And in my field and world, like every silo, we talk about it and we take it for granted. Oh, of course, everybody knows these healthy building attributes. And I was at the real estate roundtable a couple of years ago and I said something like that. Oh, we're overcomplicating this. Everybody knows the handful of things you have to do in a building. And everyone looked at me like, well, what do you mean? And the vast majority followed me to lunch, and we had this great long discussion, extended lunch, and it hit me right there that we had failed in public health. We had all this data and information that we just didn't deliver to the market. So that was the idea for this report. It's distilled down to these 9 foundations, so it's not overwhelming. It's all backed by the science. And in that report, in the middle section of the book, we talk about this. We simplify it. What is ventilation? Why does it matter to health? What does the science say? And importantly, in the book, at the end of each of those foundations, we give tips. What does the science say you should be doing for each of these foundations? So the idea there is, we can do these things up front that we argue in the book, I think effectively, that are trivial costs relative to the benefits. There's a roadmap for how to do it. It's grounded in 40 years of peer-reviewed science. So it's all doable, it's objective, it's empirical, and it goes to moving us beyond this sick building era we've been in into one where the buildings are actually our friend and trying to working on our behalf to keep us healthy and productive while we're inside our homes, schools, offices, you name it.
Joe, do you want to step through the 9?
Sure, that'd be helpful if we talk about all 9 just for a second. So we can go into these at length and even give some tips from the book. But I'd point you to, maybe I should give this as a resource. Not plugging the book here, of course. If you buy it, that's great. But
I will
depth here. But at Harvard, my Healthy Buildings program is at forhealth.org, FOR health.org. And you can look for 9 foundations. There's a nice graphic there. It talks about ventilation and air quality and thermal health. So the temperature, relative humidity. We have to be concerned with moisture and dust and pests. Of course, lighting and views matter, acoustic performance, the water quality, and last, safety and security. And the collection of these are all, for each one, there's really rich science. And if you read this report, there are great nuggets you can pull out that actually quantify this, that put the percents that you can expect and the targets you should be hitting that we know are empirically linked to better human health and performance. And in the book, we go beyond the report and that we give it a lot more detail and actually put a lot more context on this, whereas the report is maybe a 2-page summary on each. We give it a lot more depth and oomph and update the recommendations that we think people should be looking to do in their buildings.
Yeah, I think, you know, in the book, you guys do a great job going through with, you know, supporting data to sort of lay out, you know, how a healthy building really decreases costs, helps with health generally, helps with productivity. But you also say that a healthy building strategy is a good business strategy. And I think we should talk about that a little bit, just to understand, and understand it from that perspective. It's probably more John's.
Sure, we can both talk. We can both talk to this. I think it relates to competition. So landlords are always looking for some edge to rent their building, or certainly in the you know, in the core assets in the big cities they are. And at one point that was, you know, when we're going to propagate through air conditioning, you know, 100 years ago, and then elevators, and then green buildings. And even though it's taken a long time for LEED to propagate through the industry, most of the top lenders and landlords and even tenants are interested in some kind of LEED certification. So the next aspect is, how's the building compete going forward? And we wrote a case study about a new office building in New York, 425 Park Avenue, which is a Norman Foster design. The developer is L&L. And the objective is to have it be the healthiest building in New York. And arguably, their argument is the healthiest building in the world. Why would they want to do that? They want to do that because they think they'd be able to attract premium tenants. And we go through in the Harvard Business School case study the basic math of the extra capital expenditure, the range of what they might have to spend to accomplish this healthy building claim with fans and filters and windows and daylight, and whether they might be able to get more rent or not. And what I ask my students to do is to go through and say, well, what is the balance of CapEx and OpEx, and how much can you pass through and how much more rent can you get? The very clear bet by the developer is they'll be able to get a premium rent, because they think that the elite tenants they're looking for are going to look for a place where their employees can perform better. A crude way to look at it is as another amenity. So you can think, yeah, we have to have a restaurant, we have to have a health club, we have to have gardens with, or name some other amenity. Maybe the health is an amenity, which again is hard to specifically quantify, just like it's hard to quantify having a new lobby with more stone, but people do it. In a more defined way, they say to their tenants, don't you think that if your tenants are have this much higher cognitive performance in this healthy building, it's going to be worth the rent? Their argument is that in an upmarket, they get the premium. Their second argument is in a down market, they'll get the tenant. And we're about to see that be tested out in the world, because there's obviously a down market coming. And there'll be a lot of buyer power among tenants. And it's not hard to imagine a situation where maybe a government tenant or a Fortune 500 tenant would not rent in less than a LEED Silver building. Now, if they have a choice, they're going to go to a building that's objectively healthier for the same rent. So we think that that will come out in the competitive landscape. And then the second factor is, how long will it take to propagate? It's one thing to think about a premium building on Park Avenue. It's another to think about, you know, mom and pop that have a 20,000 square foot building with 2 dentists and a law firm out in the suburbs someplace. You know, when will that propagate through? And that's part of Joe and my mission and task, is to help convey the idea is that the healthy buildings are better for the tenants and will ultimately be the standard in the industry over time. But this will certainly be tested in this coming downturn, whether this premise that a healthier building will get the tenant, all else being equal, we'll find out.
Yeah, how would you guys describe the current state of the healthy building movement, how pervasive it is? And also, can you touch upon some of the certification systems that are being used today? I think it's just interesting to know kind of where this all stands today at this point.
Yeah, we talk a lot about this in the book because after we talk about the science and the business science for why we think this is a no-brainer, let's say it, we then talk about how is the market responding here? And we think it was inevitable that just like the green building certifications had risen and gotten to the point of wide adoption, and even code is now beyond green in a lot of places already, that it was inevitable that healthy building certifications would start to rise. And so we spend a chapter talking about this, and again, using it as a way to talk about the business economics and also the fundamental underlying science. In the book, we talk about 2 or 3 of the leading, current leading certifications. So I'm certain the people listening in right here are familiar with the building certification standard that came out of the Delos organization that, similar to the 9 foundations of a healthy building, grounded in the science and walks through it in terms of, what a building owner should be thinking about in terms of the actions they should be taking in their building. They give points towards this. They monitor or require monitoring of the space as a performance verification. So they've been quite vocal and have really spread the word far and wide. I remember, a couple of years ago, I was touring really all over the world talking about this healthy building movement, and wherever I went, someone would ask about the well building standard and that's a couple of years ago, right at the beginning. So they've done a nice job of kind of raising awareness and putting their marketing power towards making the case for healthy buildings. Another certification we talk about is out of the US CDC called Fitwell, now administered by a nonprofit Center for Active Design. Takes a slightly different approach. Again, all of these are grounded in health, just different aspects of it or to different depths. And they kind of take, similar to LEED, there's a points and checklist, and it's self-administered. And so the idea there is you get people to start to work towards these better attributes of their building, or at least get them thinking about, maybe facilities managers maybe hadn't been thinking about health, start thinking, well, what are the things I should be thinking about in my space? So those are really the 2 early leaders. I'd say they're different in terms, we talk about this in terms of their cost and the depth at which they go. But really what's more interesting to John and I think is where we think it should go. And we close that chapter by talking about some of these principles we think any good certification system should have if it's really going to lead to a benefit. Of course, they have to be grounded in science. It has to adapt to the latest science. It has to be verifiable. It has to be independent and objective. So we talk about these kind of core principles, and we use the certifications we mentioned in the book less as an endorsement of anyone, but just to say this is what's in the market, and this is where we hope it'll go. And we actually mentioned at that chapter in that book that it's probably the chapter of the book that will get dated the most quickly, not the core principles. I think those will stay and probably will stand forever, in real estate time. But the certifications will likely change depending on what the market likes or doesn't like. And certainly what happened with COVID-19 will shift this again as more people start to try to get into the healthy buildings movement.
I think it'll shift really fast because to your very first question, Bill, about when are people going to want to go back? Mm-hmm. Well, who's going to judge that the building is safe to go back in? Some health department, some landlord, some bank, some tenant, or some third-party expert in this field. So why wouldn't there be people who use health performance indicators about the building and what is the design of the building and what's the fan speed and what are the filters and what are the particulates, and about the individuals and what are the individuals finding for air quality and what's their temperature and all that, and continuously commissioning that, not just doing a one-time point system at design, but making sure that it's still right. So there could easily be a third-party group that says, we're going to use the health performance indicators, for example, that Joe and I describe in the book, and objectively measure them and have everybody, landlord, lender, tenant, company, and occupant, comfortable when they're in the building. Because then it becomes a question of, otherwise it's a question of who do you believe?
Right. So post-coronavirus, the landscape is going to be different. But I guess to this point in time, with respect to the movement, you mentioned in the book that, you know, there have been impediments to advancing this further. One of them that you mentioned was, you know, just real inertia in the real estate market. And you mentioned some other impediments. So what have been the sorts of things that have been impediments to you know, advancing this movement more quickly?
Sure. Having spent my whole career and thinking about innovation in construction and real estate, happy to talk about that. One is, of course, inertia, because people are saying, I have so many other things to worry about. Why am I going to fuss with this? Another is incumbents. So if you think about rating systems or inspectors, you have, we'll take, for example, the idea that you can use less energy if you have CO2 sensors in conference rooms only call for a fair share when you need it, and you have enthalpy wheels or thermal exchangers outside the building. So yes, that's a good idea, but for them to really be cost effective, you downsize the ductwork so that you are able to take advantage of these efficiencies. But what building inspector wants to sign off on that when what the code says is how many air changes per hour, or what owner wants to do that? So you have these sort of incumbent inspectors or incumbent engineers who like the situation they have, or you have incumbent players who might be in the distribution chain, who are the people who are distributing fans and filters and compressors and those kind of things, and don't want to use a different piece. So all of us in this industry are so worried about the downside risk of something not working, particularly if it's in the HVAC system or in the roof, that we're unlikely to try a new thing. I'll date myself, but when I came in the industry, flat roofs were all asphalt, built up asphalt. And the idea of a membrane roof was really crazy. And it took a long time for the membrane roofs to be adopted, because water is such a problem for landlords. And if you have a built up asphalt roof, at least you can go up and patch it. But who's going to believe Goodyear or Firestone or whoever that this membrane roof is going to work? So you have this very sensible risk aversion, particularly anything around water, whether your condenser unit is leaking or the heat pump is tripping on people or the roof is leaking. So it takes a while to push through some of these ideas. Another is that around the life cycle of buildings. You know, buildings last a long time. So it's not like getting the next generation of an iPhone or even the next generation of a car. It took maybe 20 years for catalytic converters to propagate through the US automobile industry. It took longer than that for elevators and air conditioning to propagate through buildings. And you can find people who say that of the buildings that are going to be standing in New York in 2100, 75% of them are built right now. So it's one thing to talk about a new building where the incremental cost of a better HVAC system is not that much. It's another to talk about a retrofit. So a lot of things don't really turn over until you have a major tenant moves out, and then you do that. You strip down to the shell and core and redo things. So it's not likely that someone's going to listen to us and otherwise unprompted go up and rip out the air coil unit on the roof and put in a bigger one. Although that said, a lot of this infrastructure is big enough, it's just not run enough. So the idea that you can run the fans more, change the filters more, actually doesn't cost anything in CapEx. It's a little more in OpEx. So I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, but there are a lot of long-time relationships and a lot of stuff that stays in place for quite a while that are impediments to adapting the way that we've all adapted to Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting or whatever those things are that have very short life cycles.
So longer term, I guess I mean, we've touched upon this, but I'd be curious just to see if you can kind of wrap up, you know, what kind of market impacts do you really see coming out of this? You know, we're going to come out of this pandemic, the healthy building movement is, you know, kind of gaining steam. So longer term, how do you see the market impacts playing out?
Maybe I'll take it from the consumer side and people's expectations, right? I think there's lots of questions right now people are having about, you know, what do we do now for infectious disease control? And then what do we do thinking about resiliency longer term and these more broad healthy building strategies? And there's a lot of uncertainty right now with COVID-19, but with all the uncertainty, a sure thing is that the expectations are changing. People are already talking about this. John and I, we talk about this in the book. It's one of my, I think, more interesting and favorite parts of the book, we talk about this idea that people are interviewing their building. I think that's surprising to most people, but if you look out across the social channels, if you look at Glassdoor, people are not just talking about their bad boss or their great salary or work culture, which people focus on. They're talking about their building. Basics. It smells like garbage in here. It's uncomfortable to work in here. I can't concentrate. Well, guess how that's morphed recently? You can go on now and look, and people are talking about the companies and buildings' response to coronavirus, both the good and the bad, right? So people are reporting on it in real time that, hey, my management is doing X, Y, and Z, and I feel good about that. I want to be here. Or they're not taking this seriously. I have to get out of this company and this building. So I think we can expect to see more of that. Certainly we're seeing it already. And people are aware that their building, you look at consumer sentiment right now, people are aware that the building is going to influence their health. And if you look at consumer sentiment, what are people saying right now? Nobody wants to go back. Nobody wants to go to a restaurant right now. Nobody wants to go to the theater. No one wants to see a sporting event. And people are even reluctant to go back to an office building. So that tells you something about what people are thinking about, what's top of mind, and this tells you what's coming, right? And the companies that pivot quickly here and make those improvements to the building are poised to win, because this is what the consumer is expecting. But the key part of this is going to be how you message it and communicate it. I think John made a great point there, just say, well, Joe thinks this is a good idea. No, it should be independent, should be verified. And you're going to have to let your employees and visitors know what you're doing in the building, both that they can see and observe for themselves. So in the COVID sense, enhanced cleaning and disinfection, but also all of these hidden features of the building, the ways that you're optimizing or enhancing the building for their health that they don't see. So you have to think you have to think hard about how to effectively message and communicate that. If you bring in more fresh outdoor air, people may not notice, although it's having a physiological effect. So you have to communicate all of these strategies and ground them back in the science too.
If the question is about the long view, we wrote the book because even pre-COVID, because we were persuaded that the broad business population of lenders, landlords, tenants, and workers would see that the health benefits that were objective way outweighed the costs of providing some of these health benefits, which are also objective. In a post-COVID world, this is accentuated, but we don't know actually there's two key scenarios we don't know the outcome of. One is, will COVID be contained sometime in the near future, like in a question of months, 18 months or 24, will it be a vaccine or a cure or herd immunity, or not? Will it be here with us forever, like dengue or yellow fever or car crashes, and something that we all learn to deal with? Even if it's comes under control pretty quickly, the general population isn't going to forget the worry about this aspect of health and the fact that another one could happen. So people will be aware of the health aspects of their buildings and where they go. In the real estate space, the unknown in office is also largely around this work from home. Like if you're the kind of knowledge worker who can work from home, why not? But there's plenty of jobs in the United States that aren't like that, like working in a grocery store, driving a bus, being a nurse, those kind of things you can't do from home. The other aspects of commercial real estate that will be affected more will be hospitality and retail. And I'm sure you all got the same thing I got from Marriott and the other one from Delta, saying, Marriott, here's our cleaning plan, and Delta, here's why our airlines are going to be the cleanest. They're not going to stop competing that way. They're going to have to compete in that way for a very long time, because the public's not going to forget, even if COVID goes away. Then you add on to that the ability that Joe said of people to send these reviews around, and it'll be much more prominent if somebody says on Glassdoor or Yelp or Morningstar, yeah, I got on the plane and put down the tray table and there was a pile of goo. Everybody's going to know that pretty quickly. Now, we also wrote in the book about the impact on apartment renters and landlords of individual air quality monitors and sensors. I don't know if you want us to go into that, but that's another long view competitive aspect that we think is going to shape the industry.
Right. Well, it looks like we have a decent amount of Q&A from the audience already, so it might be a good time to turn it over to Frank to go through some of those questions. Frank, you still there?
I am, sure. And for those of you who are listening, if you do have a question, please go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get all the questions addressed. But we do have a few, and the first one would be, does technology exist to screen for real-time 24/7 virus particulates within a building, restaurant, or office similar to carbon monoxide detectors?
No, so that's a quick, short answer. It's a good question. The answer is no. And actually, I would discourage against I've seen some firms offering this. Biological sample is very tricky, even for something like mold or Legionella. I've done a lot of Legionnaires disease outbreaks. It is not straightforward. I think you have to be very cautious there. But in terms of a real-time sensor, the answer is no. You're better off using CO2 and these other indicators, as we talk about in the book, as health performance indicators to give you a sense of are the building systems performing like they should, and if they're not, should you go tweak them, rather than looking for biologicals in air or dust.
Great. Another question was, can you provide some examples of some of the healthy building implementations reflected in the 425 Park Avenue case study you referenced?
The examples are not that complicated or profound. They're mostly around system capacity and providing the base building capacity to have substantially more fresh air than would be required by code, substantially better filtration than would be required by code. And Joe can walk you through the HEPA filter kind of categories. And as the filters are more higher performing, it takes a little bit more energy to push the air through them. And so those are the kind of things on the ventilation front that were done. It's also quite a bit around daylight and around I don't know the name of the glass that changes the emissivity and the transmission of different spectrum of light during the day. That also is based on science around people's moods. There's also a fair amount around public spaces and greenery. But in terms of what Joe and I think about the most, it's around the ventilation system. Did you want to add sort of generically, Joe, what the best-in-class systems look like?
Sure, yeah. So in that building too, right, so we look at ventilation, filtration, and they had pursued WELL certification, which they pursue all these points around healthy buildings. Biophilic design is in there. And we could talk about the science. I'm happy to talk about the science of any of those, but let's say on the basics of filtration, because it's relative to COVID-19, right? You want to filter the air that's coming into the building, but maybe more importantly for disease transmissions, you want to filter that recirculated air if you're not bringing in 100% outdoor air. Typically, a building has a MERV 8 filter or less, which captures a small percent of airborne particulate, largely to catch flies and or boulder catchers, right? But the idea is if you increase that filter efficiency to MERV 13 or MERV 14, you're starting to capture up to 80–90% of airborne particulate. And we know this virus transmits through both large droplet fomites or inanimate surfaces and last airborne transmission. So you can do some of these things in your building that can be effective at disease mitigation, separate from what we're talking about at 425. But at 425, they largely looked at ventilation, filtration, and the well building certification.
I'd like to add with respect to that this is an interesting phenomenon globally too, because it's assumed in Western building codes that the outside air is cleaner than the inside air. For those of you who are international investors who have buildings in Shanghai or Delhi or Mexico or Sao Paulo, that's not always true. So there will be more and more competition among buildings to say our indoor air actually is better than the outside air. And you see this in some Chinese buildings promoted now. You don't necessarily know whether you believe it or not, but it's certainly promoted. But when we all get back to work and the air gets dirty again, this is going to be another issue around cleanliness to buildings going forward, is around a building where the filtration really makes it cleaner than the air on the street.
We do have an inquiry about that case study. I know it's addressed in your book, but someone was curious if that case study was available elsewhere, and if so, where, just quickly.
It'll be available next week, actually, at Harvard Business School Publishing. So Harvard Business Publishing.
Great. The next question, realistically, when can landlords retrofit buildings to meet these specs given the COVID-19 pandemic, and how will it allow tenants to feel comfortable returning?
Yeah, so I'm working with many organizations, some multinational, and they're making these improvements right now. So I think it's smart for organizations to be taking the inventory right now of what the existing systems are and what they physically can and cannot do, which would inform what strategies you can take. Can you bring in more fresh outdoor air? Can the fans handle the larger pressure drop from the higher efficiency filter? And making these capital improvements, and if they can't, setting up a timeline for when those can be made. So it's not just we can't do it and we're done, but we can't do it today, but these are the things we're going to look to improve as time goes on. Importantly, though, I want to bring it back to that hierarchy of controls, because we can't just look at these building improvements outside the context of everything else that has to be done in terms of administrative controls, PPE, substitution, elimination, because it has to be that full layered defense approach. And so in particular, if you have a building that physically can't do some of these healthy building strategies right now, it would be the correct approach to then intensify your efforts on these other control or intervention strategies.
Great. Someone has asked, with the talk about taking temperatures of tenants and their employees as they enter buildings, is there some liability there for a landlord taking a temperature of a tenant before entering the building, and could it be an invasion of privacy issue?
So we're not lawyers, so we're probably not going to talk there, but I'll point you to a great resource. The law firm Mintz-Levin put out something great last night. If you're on Twitter, if you look at my Twitter handle, I posted it. It's J_G_Allen. But it gives the legal guidance, a great guidance, simple document on what's allowed in terms of screening for temperature, what's allowed in terms of serological testing, what can you require vaccinations? So it's a really terrific resource. You should look that up. And I'm happy to circulate around, Bill, if that's helpful.
Joe, does that document, I've not seen it, does it talk about exposure if landlords do not do that? Because there's, for me thinking as a landlord, there's liability, there's exposure either way. If you screen people or if you don't screen people, some ambulance chaser is going to pursue you either way.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I don't remember if that's in there or not, but we'll send it around and take a look. Good point, though.
So this is probably something that you guys know at Berdon better than I do, but you could imagine plenty of random lawsuits from building occupants saying, oh, it was your responsibility to keep me protected because you knew something about some coronavirus in December, and as a landlord, you should have done X, Y, Z. But, this is, I'm sure you've had plenty of other calls about this. Pretty much every real estate contract in the United States is already in some kind of non-compliance, and we're going to take a long time to sift those through.
I will add one other thing on that point, because I have been working with firms on this, and I have been involved in toxic torts related to real estate. And outside of the legal, and in John's point, what could or should you do? But addition to that is making sure you're following, of course, federal, local guidance, which changes, and grounding your decisions, not only on what you do, but also your gating criteria for when you can advance the separate phases based on these other criteria and the science. So it's not just our crisis management team thinks this. It's no, this is what CDC says, this is what WHO says, this is what the latest scientific experts are saying, and we're grounding our decisions in that in addition to the legal. Yeah.
Great. This is an interesting one. Are there any materials being used or new materials being developed that stay clean longer?
Sure. So there's been a lot of focus on particularly about antimicrobial surfaces. I think that's what you're talking about there. So here the evidence is really mixed, and I point to what Kaiser Permanente has been doing, right? One of the largest healthcare providers, if not the largest, in their buildings. They have looked at this question repeatedly over the past 10 years and revisited it, and they come to the conclusion that these antimicrobial surfaces or features do not confer an infectious disease control benefit. They have many hospital systems, many hundreds of clinics on site. So I turn to that for the evidence base on or decision making, and again pointing to who's doing what and what the best in class are doing, and they don't find a benefit. I will say that this is an area that's likely to change. At least the thinking will be likely to change, and as new products come online, I bet you'll see a lot more of these offered. But in terms of a strategy, I think there are some places where it could be useful if done right, say a bathroom. But I also think that some of these other strategies are even better. So could you make capital improvements instead of trying to make everything, nano silver coated? How about just touchless faucets, touchless flush, automatic doors? And there are never going to be enough products that are coated in such a way that they're self-cleaning, so to speak. But just plain old boots on the ground, enhanced cleaning and disinfection of high-touch surfaces. These are strategies that we know are effective in minimizing risk. And in addition to what the building owner has to do, what the tenant's responsibilities are, and last and most importantly, we haven't really talked about that, the individual responsibility. The only way through this is if everyone's working together. So instead of thinking, well, the silver bullet here is going to be some, surface we can coat every contact surface in the building on, the building can do some of these engineering controls, and the individual has to do their own controls too, staying home when sick, covering the cough, washing their hands. And these are more effective control strategies for infectious disease.
It's almost a good segue into this next question. So we've been talking about buildings as a whole and in general, but can you provide any guidance or advice concerning individual workspaces within buildings and inside offices, and what landlords and tenants can do to kind of help make those healthier environments?
Sure. I mean, broadly, if you want to start broadly and then get to COVID, I think there's a lot you can do. Let's speak broadly first. So, we spend a whole chapter in the book, and Bill, we were talking about this before this all started, about healthier material selection. There's this other slow roll crisis that's happening in terms of chemicals that interfere with our sex hormones, that can be carcinogenic, that are in the materials all around us, in our offices, homes, schools, cars, airplanes. So we can do a better job there in terms of material selection to make our workspace and our work zones healthier. In terms of COVID, I think the recommendations get just more, they tie back to the original, what we've all heard a lot is maintaining physical distancing. Can you put up additional barriers to present a physical barrier to large droplet transmission? Are we making sure the airflow is not just the correct amount of air coming in, but we're not blowing streams of air past people and onto others? So, and of course, enhanced disinfection and cleaning of the surfaces. There are some firms that are just removing the telephones entirely. So the next way we're going to have phone calls is just through Zoom or our cell phones, and taking away, and even making sure that people clear off their desks. So each night you can do an actual deep, thorough cleaning. So there are strategies both for COVID and then more broadly about, what constitutes a healthy work space goes beyond infectious disease for sure.
Okay, we have two more questions. I'm going to combine two into one. One is, and you kind of addressed it a bit already, would HEPA filter change enhance protection of the COVID-19 virus specifically? And then also, can COVID-19 particulates travel within HVAC ductwork vents between offices and conference rooms? And if so, what can be done to the HVAC systems to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, great question. So on the filter specifics, right? HEPA is great. You've probably seen 99.97% removal efficiency on the side of a box, and I'll explain what that is because there are some misconceptions about this. That's actually the removal efficiency at its least efficient, 0.3 microns, particles that are 0.3 microns. At bigger and smaller, it's actually darn near 100%. So filters are rated to their weakest. So HEPA is actually works quite well. MERV 13, more 14, you maybe get to 80, 90% removal efficiencies. The problem with HEPA is that most of the times in your ductwork, the fans have a hard time pulling that much air through a HEPA filter. In that case, the MERV 13 and 14 can be quite effective. If you're thinking about portable air purifiers, they should definitely be HEPA. So that's something that's a little closer to the source. They can be effective at cleaning the air and work quite well. In terms of the last part of the question, how the mechanical system may aid in the spread, certainly we see evidence that this virus, the viral particles are small enough that they stay airborne and can stay airborne for a couple hours. So depending on how the system is operating, it can pull in air that has viral particles and distribute it to other parts of the building. This is why we're recommending in-duct filtration at a high efficiency level, a MERV 13 or higher, so that if you have that filter bank and you pull up a viral particle, it hits that filter, gets impacted out or by other means, and you prevent the transmission to somewhere else in the building. Great.
Questions keep coming in, so everyone please be mindful that we are coming close to an end, so we'll do our best. One just came in about using a fogging machine to disinfect, and is that an effective disinfecting method for buildings? And if so, how often should it be done?
That's a good question. There's a lot of nuance in that one, but I'll just say currently some groups like EPA and American Industrial Hygiene Association are not recommending that as a use. It can be effective. I think it all depends on the application. And I also think you have to put it in the context of your other controls in the whole hierarchy, including your enhanced disinfection and cleaning, boots on the ground, just cleaning surfaces. So I think there could be a role for it to play, but it's really going to depend on the application. I don't see the future where we're going to be wholesale fogging our buildings nonstop as a control measure.
Okay, and this one is not specifically about building, but I think every New York City professional and resident is wondering about it, is since commuting is a major issue, any thoughts on the use of public transportation and what the MTA and other transportation companies should be doing to help disinfect and prevent the spread of viruses such as COVID?
Yeah, this one's also really tricky. I don't see a way around this other than this kind of phased approach where if we slowly reopen the different parts of the economy, by a slow reopen, we will have essentially de-densified part of the public transportation system in that way. I also think companies are going to have to start thinking about staggering their workforces into AB days or extending the work shift. That not only benefits de-densification of the building, but also prevents the rush hour crush at 8:30 to 9, 12 o'clock, everybody rounds out to lunch, 5:01, everyone's out the door. That can't happen. It's not going to work in buildings. It's not going to work in public transportation, at least in the beginning. I do think there are things public transportation can be doing in terms of the same basic principles of ventilation, filtration, enhanced disinfection and cleaning, and doing your best to manage the administrative control side of this, managing controls and flows of people. All of us are going to have to understand that this is going to be wildly inconvenient. As the economy reopens, it's not going to look like January where you rush in and think, well, hey, I'm just going to pack in and jam on this next subway car. It can't happen that way. And then last, I think the PPE, I've been vocal about this. I've written about this in the Washington Post. People are going to have to wear masks. There's no question, particularly in public spaces, and many cities are mandating this now. But that's a control strategy. So there's a lot more. It's complicated there, but I'll give you an example. We released another op-ed recently in USA Today talking about how to control the virus in a car. We could be asymptomatic, and just rolling down your window 3 inches gives enough ventilation to significantly reduce your risk from inhaling a viral particle airborne. So if you take that and apply it to other situations, again, it's just the same thing of ventilation. So whether you're in a taxi, an Uber, your own car, or you're in public transportation, bus, if we can get more ventilation in there, either by windows or otherwise, this can go a long way to helping with that one mode of transmission, which is airborne. And we have to address the others, which is large droplet, close contact, that's covering your cough, wearing a mask, and keeping that physical distancing.
Great, gentlemen. Well, in the interest of time, I think we've hit the 11:35 mark, so we want to close this out. For all of our attendees, there will be a recording of the webinar that will be sent out in a follow-up email, and it will also be available on the Berdon website. Again, if you are interested in purchasing Joe and John's book, there was a link to do so in the invitation, and there will also be a link in the follow-up email that will have the recording of this webinar. Joe, John, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to discuss this topic. I'm sure there's going to be many more discussions on this as we look to come out of the pandemic and try to resume some type of normalcy or engage our new normal, whatever that may end up being. But thank you again. We look forward to hearing from you more about on this topic. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to email Berdon at contact@berdonllp.com, and we'll do our best to get answers to all of your questions. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.